Hi everyone. A few years ago I had a deadline to write a book and I just couldn't get down to it. I don't know why. It's sometimes like that. When there's pressure, you just can't do it. And although I had this big deadline, I completely sidelined the project for a while. And I spent 10 days writing a completely different book. It was called Scorpion Soup. And I published it originally in, 2013, I think, in a very limited, very beautiful edition. Very few copies have ever been made, put up for sale, because it's mostly been an edition that I've given away to friends and anyone I felt like. But I'm now bringing out a paperback edition, and here it is in my backlist series. I wanted to read the introduction and maybe the afterword as well. This story, well, as you'll see, it's rather inspired by the 1001 Nights in the way that one story leads on to another, and then another, and another, and eventually comes back to the start. So this is the introduction first of Scorpion Soup. When I was small, I was told stories from morning until night. I was told stories about genies and witches and about great birds that could carry elephants away on their wings, and stories about distant kingdoms and magical lands ruled by warrior kings. I was told stories of good and bad and stories of hope and others of despair. I was even told stories about stories, and all the while I listened, amazed. The more I listened, the more my mind worked, and the more I came to understand that these stories had a kind of power about them, a secret lifeblood, all of their own. They were magical instruments, machineries that could alter the state of mind and change the way we think. Stories are a part of the default programming of man. They are within us all, born into us, and they make us who we are. They make us human. Since earliest childhood, I have feasted on stories, especially those contained in the 1001 Nights. A treasury of storytelling and culture that is, in itself, a labyrinth of worlds. The Nights conjures realms more fantastical than any other I know. What I like best is when there are tales concealed within tales, interwoven, complex, mesmerizing to the senses and to the soul. To descend down through the layers of stories is, I believe, to be reborn into a dominion of fantasy, one touched by real magic. Scorpion Soup is a small hymn to the 1001 Nights and to the stories that have made me who I am. And now I want to read the afterword that I wrote relatively recently, actually. Since early childhood, I was raised with the notion of a chain of transmission. It's the idea that progress can be made by layers of action, achievement and thought, layers laid down through a group or even by members of a single family. In my case, the latter was very much the focus of attention. My father, the writer and thinker Idris Shah, devoted his life to making certain psychological and philosophical traditions available in the West. Much of the material he presented had, of course, been in existence there for centuries, but more often than not, it was as though the thinking was a valuable tool kept in a glass case, viewed with awe, but rarely actually used. Like a relay runner in a race, my father was the one who passed me the baton, urging me to run with it until it was my time to pass it on. He was, in turn, the guardian of the baton that had been entrusted to him by his father, the Sardar Iqbal Ali Shah, who had been handed it by his own father. This theme of a chain of transmission runs through my family's core and is regarded as more important than anything else, of greater consequence than any single member of the family. It constitutes a kind of mass groupthink, a groupthink that embraces me, my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and all those who came before them. It's my mother and my grandmother too, my aunts, uncles, cousins, and all the rest, forming a single unified contribution to human society, bridging east and west. My father used to explain how, whether I understood it or not, I was part of a machinery that was laden with certain responsibilities. He went on and on about it, sometimes filling me with dread and with fear, as it would do to any small child. I didn't understand why I couldn't be like all the other kids in the school playground, why I had to be part of a chain of transmission that seemed to make no sense at all. As the years passed and I began to understand the world and its ingrained systems, I learnt that change takes time. Beyond that, I learnt that it takes a group effort as well. And recalibration is only possible through increments. One of the most fundamental aspects of the chain of transmission I was handed and expected to pass on relates to what you might call looped thinking. It's the sense that by circling back over the same ground in different ways, we learn to absorb ideas, and once we've learned to absorb, we're ready to apply what we've learned. The reason I'm explaining all this is not trying to impress anyone reading it with what I or members of my family have ever been exposed to. Rather, I'm hoping to pass on something else, something related to looped thinking and to the chain of transmission. You could call it framing. As those who've read any of 1001 Nights knows, the story is set up in a curious way. Having discovered that his queen had been unfaithful, King Shahryar resorts to marrying a virgin bride each day and having her executed at dawn. This barbaric practice continues until, that is, the daughter of the Grand Vizier, whose name is Shahrazad, marries the king and begins to tell him a story that at dawn remains unfinished. Intrigued at how it ends, he allows his new bride to keep her throat for another day. Each evening, the story continues for 1001 nights. In that time, certain ideas, themes, and bodies of information are revisited time and again. And as the story moves forward, certain tales spring off into other tales, which in turn give forth to framed stories of their own. At one point, there are as many as 9 tales in play. Imagine it, a tale in 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 a tale. This framing appears as a tool in other Oriental treasuries as well, and it's been copied throughout history. Chaucer borrowed it for his Canterbury Tales, and more recently, in the 1930s, my own grandfather employed it in his Golden Pilgrimage. In that volume, a group of travellers thrown together at a remote caravanserai share stories in stories. After reading The Golden Pilgrimage as a child, I longed to create a looped structure that would eventually circle back to its beginning while encompassing the kind of themes and ideas I had been raised to pass on. I never planned for Scorpion Soup to be that book. Indeed, I never planned it at all. One drab Monday morning, having slouched down into my office chair at Al Khalifa, my Moroccan home, I read a grim message from an equally grim publisher ordering me to knock out a book I didn't want to knock out. I remember reading the threatening email 3 or 4 times and sighing long and hard. The last thing any writer wants is to create something where and when there's no creative spark. So having sighed 3 or 4 more times, I let my attention drift from the computer screen over the desk and out through the open doors of my library into the garden. I saw myself wandering down to Casablanca's port. The next thing I knew, I'd begun the tale that was to spiral down, down, down through a series of tales before the last line looped back to the first. In most cases, I love the writing process more than I can describe. I love the business of transforming a blank screen or a blank page into a document that changes the way people see the world around them. I love the raw ingenuity of the writer's craft, and I love the way a book can be a kind of Trojan horse, a container for ideas, themes, and values, all of them far more important than the characters or the storyline. I think it would be true to say that I loved writing Scorpion Soup more than any other book I've ever written, because it was a book that truly wrote itself. As I typed, I would watch my hands from a distance as though they weren't mine, in the same way that a puppeteer must marvel at their hands having taken on the lifeblood all of their own. The way I see it, Scorpion Soup was a story that my fantastical or alter ego gave the rest of me as a gift, as a daydream, a reminder that since childhood I was charged with passing on the baton, itself a loop of collected culture, my small part in the chain of transmission.